Steve Izenour is a senior associate with Venturi Scott Brown Associates in Philadelphia. He's a very gifted designer. He's co-authored 2 books. He's participated over the years in a number of very significant research projects. He was educated at Swarthmore College, Japan, and at Yale. He won an AIA National Honor Award for his designs and all kinds of state, local, and regional awards. And he's taught, lectured every place you can imagine in the United States and around the world. He's been with Bob Venturi and his wife, Denise Scott Brown, in their professional practice for quite a long time and has been with them through thick and through thin. And now, if you read Time magazine, you see this last week's article that referred to Bob Venturi as maybe the most influential architect of the late 20th century. And in a little caption under the picture of Bob and Denise, it says they finally are getting the credit they deserve for charting the course of contemporary architecture. Well, I'm really glad that we have Steve with us again tonight, because he was very much responsible for helping them chart this course. And he's one of the few people we've had on our lecture series who gave, I thought, a really great lecture a few weeks ago and offered to come back here and give you more material tonight. And he's had about 2 or 3 hours sleep, and he's going to be in Columbus at 8 o'clock in the morning for a meeting. So I don't want to keep him up any longer than I have to, but it's a real pleasure to welcome Steve Izenour back this evening.
What I thought I'd do, since we kind of ended, I think, at the end of commercial architecture and houses last time, was to, and we never got to things like the National Gallery and the New Seattle Art Museum, which just opened a few weeks ago. And since I'm coming back to Columbus, at least once a month, I thought, it'd be fun to kind of run through some of the recent museum stuff. This will also be a test. We're just finishing a competition that goes out tomorrow to France for a new French government building. So most of us have been on charrette for most of the week. And so this will be the first test of whether you all can fall asleep. Let's see if I can fall asleep at the same time I'm giving a lecture. The whole question, last time we talked a lot about, some of the more theoretical ideas that we've dealt with about, the American city and the whole American context and scene. And, in a way, it's all kind of peripheral things, because in a way, a lot of those things don't have a hell of a lot to do with what we do every day, because basically the practice for most of the last 20 years has basically been a small to medium-sized practice that primarily, 90% of our work is kind of institutional work for universities, museums, things like that. And so, ideas from Las Vegas and all this stuff aren't all that relevant a lot of the time in that kind of practice. And so, while we're intrigued by those things, and certainly a lot from it, it's not kind of what we do every day. And that's true with a lot of architectural ideas. Architecture, almost everybody, we talk a lot about elevation and facades and symbolism, but when you come right down to it, architecture is primarily done in plan for a great extent. You're solving problems in plan for people, because that's where kind of 75 to 80% of the effort in anybody's building goes, no matter what they talk about philosophically, if they're kind of doing the job they're paid to do, at any rate, that's where their effort goes. So to try to put that in some kind of context with these buildings, I think this kind of opening slide is important, because it kind of shows you it says something about the environment that we're all working in right now. And it's an environment where the volume is very high. I mean, it's high in that, when we look around and see the way people dress, like the Bob's little sketch of the lady on the left with the giant buttons and the exaggerated shoulders, there's a kind of level of exaggeration. And a lot of things stylistic, or when we look at a lot of the decon stuff like on the right, it's super hype. It's very much the kind of hype out of the last 20 years of the popular environment brought into quote unquote higher environment, where you kind of turn the volume up and you do a lot of very, contrasting, jarring things. You can give all kinds of philosophical reasons for that, but when you come right down to it, it comes down to kind of a question of visual style and kind of what's floating around out there and what people are interested in and what their sensibilities are. And that cuts right across architecture, usually fairly late, cueing into those things, but inevitably we cue into it. So it's, whether you react against it or you're all for it, it's kind of a basic part of the environment that I think that we all work in these days. Next slide. Now, I'll just kind of turn the clock back a long ways to kind of move into this museum stuff. And I'm just going to show some museum projects tonight. This is a real oldie, from back in the 60s, the Football Hall of Fame, which, was certainly, very outrageous at the time it was done. The whole idea of a building, which becomes a giant building board behind which there's some kind of exhibit, in this case an exhibit about collegiate football. The site for this, which kind of made it not totally insane, was along the New Jersey Turnpike in New Brunswick. And so the big building board, which kind of was at one end of a symbolic football field, was kind of seen from the expressway. Needless to say, and this is kind of a fascinating, this was a competition, and interestingly, when this building, I didn't work in the office when this building was done. It was a 3-person office back in those days. But I did work for Charles Moore, and he was the professional advisor on this competition. And so I was one of the slaves that kind of had to tote the boards around, for the jury for a whole weekend up in New Haven. And this scheme, interestingly, it didn't even make it through the first cut, except a bunch of us really loved it who were working, kind of toting the boards around. So we kind of, every time it didn't get cut, we put it in the save pile. So we kept this alive for about a day and a half in the competition. So finally people noticed it, the jury finally noticed it by the second day and gave it an honorable mention. But it would have been a dead dog if we hadn't cheated. And in the context, the winner was was this kind of concrete pillbox sunk into the ground that had nothing. You wouldn't have known. It could have been could have been a church. It could have been a part of the Maginot Line. It could have been almost anything in concrete, except you had no idea what it had to do with football. And it was designed by a Swiss architect who was, I think, teaching in a school out this way, maybe, in the Midwest at the time. But it shows you the context. In the context of the time, in the 60s, this was extremely radical stuff. The idea of two-dimensional, using communication as the basic element of architecture. The message, if you were, and being very blatant and upfront about it. Next slide. Of course, it had this great drawing. This is, if you ever get a chance to see a drawing show of ours, this is one of the greatest drawings I think that's ever come out of the office. It's just a wonderful drawing. This slide doesn't do it justice because it turns it all into kind of black and white. And actually, it's a collage that's just totally pasted up out of pieces of newspaper, and the football is actually a piece of felt in it. And it's just this kind of wonderful evocation of this idea of this great barrel vaulted, almost religious space where you go and the reliquaries are up to your right, for the sweaty jock straps and everything, and you have this kind of wonderful thing of kind of projections, and this is all being done in the same year as I remember of Montreal Expo in 67. And so there was a big impact. And Montreal Expo was kind of the first time that you saw kind of big scale media stuff kind of being used, very dramatically in exhibition context. And the idea that, you could create space with light and images, was really big thing now. It's every disco in the last 25 years since then, but or rock club, but or rock performance. But this was a very early example of kind of taking those kind of ideas and then representing those kind of ideas in this type of drawing. Next slide. So that kind of basic idea that, you know, museums are a lot about images. They aren't just about space and traditional architectural form. Now, you know, obviously one can be very extreme about that in their competition for a bunch of football memorabilia. And it all becomes, all media is the message in that context. Obviously, when we get to more legitimate museums in a minute, the balance between that kind of hype, that kind of exaggeration, is going to be, you know, a much more subtle balance, because you're not going to do the same techniques dealing with some 500-year-old painting as you are with some musty old football, which is inherently uninteresting. And so your job as a designer is to try to make that football somehow interesting to somebody, where one assumes the 500-year-old painting probably is. Now this is another type of museum commission that's going up right now. And this is a kind of utter contrast again to what we're going to see in a minute in Seattle and in London. This is a little children's museum. I think maybe I forget whether I got to the Philadelphia Treehouse in the last lecture. Kind of wonderful kids' treehouse with all the kind of giant objects and sculpture that they climb along that they did about 5 years ago. But this is in that same kind of genre, except this is a new building, whereas that was a kind of renovation of a wonderful old 19th century Furness building. This is kind of real cheap, down and dirty, and a very typical type of program that you see a lot of cities building. It's a children's museum, and the program for these things is pretty much the same every place. It's a series of fairly traditional classrooms and whatnot, and a little auditorium. And then it's some very large, basically loft-like space in which these organizations kind of create interactive exhibits for relatively young kids. Some of these exhibits are pretty constant and remain for a number of years, and then probably 50% of them change almost every 6 months or every year. So it's almost a shopping center for kids. And in fact, in a lot of these, one of the kind of parties they use is kind of a supermarket for kids almost, you know, where the kids can go in and play all these roles and whatnot. And the kind of educational philosophy is that these things are supposed to be highly interactive, you're supposed to be able to touch and kind of mess around with most things in it. The site for this is, if you know anything about Houston, it's out near Rice and the existing art museum. In fact, the Houston Art Museum, Museum of Fine Arts, is just down the street to your right, about 4 blocks. Given the kind of sprawl type of grid that you have in Houston, the building has the whole block to itself with, you know, parking to an adjacent block. So the building, the entrance kind of inflects to a corner because everybody's going to arrive here basically by car or by bus. And the street running perpendicular to this bins here at the bottom of the plan is basically your big bus drop-off where all the school groups kind of get dropped off in the morning. The building's basically slab on grade, real dumb, deflected corner entrance, kind of public spaces in terms of conventional classrooms and whatnot, looking back out to the street. Kind of long kids' hall or axial space that kind of cuts right through the building, connects the auditorium and the exhibit spaces and the classroom space. Kind of organizes the whole building. An exterior space beyond, kind of private outdoor play areas, and then beyond that, a small kind of little butler building for all the shops and backup stuff where they build their exhibits and whatnot. So it's a really simple, and this building's being built for like $75 a square foot, which is relatively cheap for an institutional building, to put it mildly, even in Houston. Next slide. Here's an early conceptual sketch of this. And the idea at the beginning was, again, that this was literally going to be a slab-on-grade steel frame building because of the budget. And probably you weren't going to be able to afford anything any more than drive-in, kind of steel stuff to drive it. So the idea was, you know, what would be the image of this thing? And so what we kind of grabbed onto, and the client kind of liked, because I guess they didn't go ahead with it, was an image of kind of kids' drawing of the Houston Art Museum. Houston Art Museum is a kind of 1920s, beautiful, neoclassical, very proper limestone building. And so this is kind of like almost the idea, or kind of the approach to this that we took was, it's almost like the kids went to visit the museum down the street, went back to school and drew a picture of where they went. And this becomes almost a kid's exaggeration of a neoclassic, quote, proper art museum, with the addition of, you know, big letters, very colorful ornament, but all of it very flat, because literally it's cut out of drive-in. This is literally, you know, being made out of shit on a shingle, as John Moore used to call it. So it's, you know, it's kind of, this is the other antithesis of, you know, Seattle and the National Gallery. Next slide. So here it is more developed, the kind of drive-in elevation, and then this elevation is the bus drop-off elevation, which is basically held up by a series of 15-foot-high kids. We call them carry-on kids. That are just all out of fiberglass and have a lollipop column going through there. You know what? Holding up the building, and this is a fascinating exercise doing this, kids. And again, they're kind of, and you walk under and through the kids. I mean, we wanted to have one of them standing on his or her head, but we weren't allowed to, because if we picked one kid to have stand on their head, they were obviously having more fun. So if it was a white kid or a black kid, then we were saying that a white or black kid could have more fun. And the kind of sociological implications of doing that facade, it's taken a year and a half, you know, the mixture of boys and girls, every color and shade, and then, you know, how to do unisex clothing, because you obviously can't have dresses on the girls because that's sexist. So, you know, the whole, I mean, the design of those kids is like you could write a sociological textbook about. More time went into them than the whole rest of the building combined, just because of all the social implications. Next slide. Whoops, sorry. You can probably find a few of these are going to be upside down because I threw them in so fast. Just take that out and turn it over. I'll just stop there and then we'll go back to the other one. This is kind of working out that ornament and drive it. Drive it's a kind of interesting and limiting material. I mean, you know, about all you can do with drive it is you change the color and you can incise it to a certain extent because it's basically urethane foam, you know, blocks glued together, coated with this gum. And so you can kind of route it, you know, and to give it a little bit of relief. That's about it. And so this is working out those big columns, those big abstracted columns, with just the routing detail and then the color applied to it. Here worked out full size in foam board, which is basically what the building is going to build out of there. Next slide. Whoops, you're still upside down. You got to turn that slide back over. There you go. Okay, there we go. And here are some studies now for kind of, again, working on the elevation and then working on this kids' hall. This kind of big one-point perspective space that kind of ties the exhibit side of the building to the educational side of the building, and you kind of see all the way down. And we're trying things like forests and kind of architectural motifs of different types of arches. The one that we finally ended up with is basically this one in the lower left. It's just a rather abstract series of ornamental arches, which are all in a kind of rainbow perspective, you know, spectrum going down through the building. Next slide. We wanted to do more representational things like forests and stuff, but the client was scared about that stuff. Next slide. Here's a view then that you're probably going to see more or less as you drive up on the kind of busy public street with this kind of monumental drive-in cartoon of a, you know, classical art museum, and then you can see your kind of kids and buses, you carry out kids and buses off to the right. Next slide. This building will be finished next fall, probably September, October. This is another crazy project that we worked on about 2 years ago with a team made up of SOM New York, Frank Geary, and ourselves. And it's something called Mass MoCA. Whether it ever happens or not depends a lot on politics and a lot of other things. It's kind of going no place fast right now. But it was Tom Krenz, who was at Williams College, is now the head of the Guggenheim Museum, and it's kind of the ultimate example of the new breed in museum directors. You know, he's got got a degree in art history and an MBA from Yale, you know. So, I mean, these guys are highly entrepreneurial, and their whole attitude toward art museums is that, you know, they're not scholarly places, but it's showmanship and you know, tremendous amount of kind of commercial chutzpah. Kind of scares a lot of people in the museum world, these guys like Krentz. But his idea was that this is Williamstown, Mass., which is your kind of classic bottom of the barrel New England mill town, you know, where the last major industry pulled out and moved southward to Mexico 10, 15 years ago. And, you know, it's extremely depressed, western Massachusetts, with a few Tony things like Williamstown and things like that near it, or the, you know, some of the summer places and ski resorts, but basically a very depressed place. But what it had was a series of mill buildings with 1.5 million square feet kind of just sitting there, unused. And so his idea, and a wonderful old 50s shopping center you can see over here, had a lot of empty space. Most of it dating from the late 19th, early 20th century. Kind of these classic New England mill buildings, you know, going on and on and on, brick, along the little river that, you know, originally they dumped all the dye chemicals into, because this thing was a giant kind of woolen dye factory. His idea, which was fairly brilliant, was that there's a lot of conceptual and art of the last 20, 25 years, particularly sculpture. It's of immense scale and doesn't exist in physical form because it's such, you know, one piece might take 10, 20,000 square feet. You know, got things like Don Flavin and Richard Serra and all these guys, Karofsky. And so most of this stuff only exists as blueprints someplace, or maybe a few public pieces here and there, you know, giant Oldenburg someplace. But and very little of it ever gets exhibited because what, you know, modern museum, urban museum can give over that amount of space to, quote, a piece of art. Obviously their space is much too valuable to them, and in a commercial sense, they just can't afford to do it. So his idea was, okay, I'll get Hans's great, you know, collection. I'll get all these artists to give this immense scale stuff. I've got 1.5 million free square feet in effect, you know, in the middle of nowhere. This is the only place in the world where you can see this stuff. Well, and people will come, even though it's in the middle of nowhere, even though it's 4 hours north of New York, or, you know, 3 hours west of Boston. You know, people will still come there. Enough people will come there in a year because I can do this. This place doesn't need guards. It doesn't even need heat, right? I mean, what's a giant 5 tons of Corten steel? You don't have to air condition it, you know. I mean, or Richard Flavin, you know, so what if somebody steals a fluorescent tube out of it, put another one in? You know, I mean, this stuff is inherently kind of, you know, there's nothing, quote, of quality on both an environmental or conservation sense about most of this stuff. So you can run a museum of 1.5 million square feet with a very small number of people. You can heat the space to 60 degrees in the winter and you won't cool it in the summer. You know, I mean, in other words, you can run this, you can take this space, which you can get basically for next to nothing, and put this stuff there, and enough thousand people will make the trek. Now, if enough people come, you can get some spin-off. You know, maybe you have it helps support a motel, a couple restaurants, maybe you can even get some art-related type, you know, places to kind of open outlets up here, you know, a bookstore or something like that. But at any rate, they did a lot of economic pro formas on this kind of thing, convinced enough politicians because this guy Krentz is unbelievably super salesman. And Dukakis was still governor back in those days, and Massachusetts was a big booming place economically. So this, except for this part of the state. So the idea was, okay, this poor little town, blue-collar town, we kind of get by with a little bit of the spin-offs and the money that a thing like this would generate with tourist dollars. So they put together this high-powered team of designers to kind of go in and kind of do this feasibility study for this thing, convince the state to put up the money for the renovation and the stabilization and kind of getting this thing off the ground. So this is kind of an image, a very early image of this thing, where each firm, we all have kind of specific responsibilities in this. SOM was kind of the overall coordinating firm. Frank Gehry kind of did restaurants and sculpture, and we did most of the kind of techie museum type stuff because we had the most experience for that kind of stuff. But when we also had a little fun, we thought, well, this thing's got to have a big high reader coming into town from Williamstown, so we'll give it a giant chimney with art coming out of the top. Everybody, you have to have a little fun. But this is basically a very non-architectural project in the sense that all the architects felt that we should be totally self-effacing except for some having fun like this for a few hours. That basically these buildings were rather beautiful in themselves in a nitty-gritty sort of way, and we weren't going to go and mess with them. We were going to add that the architecture didn't want to get in the way of the artists here because this is a whole collection of artists who hate architects anyhow, but they really want to be architects. So, there's a very delicate kind of situation going on when you're dealing with these guys who are, to a great extent, a lot of them doing architecture themselves. Next slide. So, the one rendering we did do of this was this kind of neat. Actually, this is about twice as long as it appears on the screen. And the way it was done was we just took a series of photographic views. I couldn't find a plan of this when I went rushing out of the office today, but the plan is kind of your classic industrial ad hoc plan. This thing kind of sits on an island between two rivers. And it's just a series of giant buildings all interconnected by the greatest kind of decon bridges and crazy smokestacks. It's a kind of classic 19th century industrial landscape. And what we were saying was, don't screw with that. It's really rather beautiful in its own kind of way. And in fact, this can be a drive-in museum most of the year. Because look, except in the height of the tourist season in the summer, when maybe you get a few thousand people showing up here in a day, in the rest of the year, you probably have a few hundred people showing up here in a day. So, what the heck? The idea was, since this thing stretches almost, 3/4 of a mile from the entrance to the last building, was that you literally could drive in here, and you just drive into all these courtyards, which is the way it worked industrially, obviously. And you park outside the building that has the stuff you want to see, and you go in. It's a total kind of drive-in museum, because that's the way an industrial complex is set up. And so we said, look, what you don't want to do is go in and do cute little, foundation plantings and everything. This is just asphalt running into really tough brick buildings, and then just a wonderful rhythm to this window. So what we're showing here is, kind of in the section perspective where you're cutting through buildings, is different types of galleries, and in there in the middle, we're actually having an inn built into the old thing, so you can actually stay there. Some stores. Frank Gehry is doing his whiz bang restaurants out here on the point where the two rivers come together. Our big hard smokestack, but basically we're doing almost nothing. Next slide. Whoops. And then, some of the ideas of, this is the view from kind of the main street of town, where even the buildings themselves, industrial buildings, they don't give them names like the university does. They call it building number 10 or building number 13. And that's the way a big industrial. And so we just went with that. And each building just gets its big number, and then under that kind of low reader that tells you, what art is in that building in that 100,000 square feet. Next slide. And here it's the same idea. And it's just kind of Xeroxes of these courtyards, again, with then cut paper to kind of show you the only thing we're doing. We're not cleaning this up at all. It's just as funky as the day they moved out. We just moved art and let people drive right into this. Next slide. Now, here comes the utter antithesis to that, obviously. This is the National Gallery. Massimoka is, kind of architects being very faceless in one way. One, because of the character of the architecture. Two, because of the character of the art. In a kind of almost industrial context. And this is the utter different, reverse, 180-degree reverse of that. An extremely complex aesthetic, political, and social site. Everybody's kind of aware to some extent, I guess, of the 20-plus years of kind of politics, with Prince Charles, instead of being the last example of this. The site had something like 6 or 7 schemes since the 1950s, designed for it. The last big one before we finally won the competition that built this building was the one that Prince Charles called a carbuncle on an old friend, and kind of shot it down. It was his first great foray into architectural criticism. Out of that debacle, when those 5 schemes were thrown out, the Sainsbury's, who were kind of the A&P fortune of Great Britain, very large supermarket fortune, came forward and said that they would give the building to the country. This is rather interesting. That's kind of typical in the U.S. I mean, like Mellon's building the National Gallery in Washington. The whole idea of the Carnegies, et cetera, most universities, derive an awful lot of what they do from that type of philanthropy. In a place like England, there's almost no tradition. In fact, in Europe in general, very little tradition of that kind of wealthy people giving things, buildings and things like that. So it was a very dicey kind of thing politically because there aren't many traditions of that. And so the client situation was extremely complex. You had a donor family that was going to stay involved totally in the design and construction of the building in a very personal way. You had a giant state bureaucracy, which is the National Gallery, government employees basically that run this National Government Museum. And then you had the poor architects caught between all these conflicting parties, and all the kind of notoriety that the job and the site and everything have, it's like, and the level of kind of public interest in architecture in England, is just totally dumbfounding to somebody from the States. The biggest, most important job, after all, Philip Johnson made the cover of Time, I guess, once, right? That's the only architect that I can remember that ever made the cover of Time. Architecture, even in its most dramatic, is like the second section of the newspaper. It is not a big deal in most people's perspective. Whereas here, through the whole design process, you literally were in the public eye and on the TV in a way that you just can't believe would happen to an architect in this country. So it's a diabolically difficult environment in which to design, fraught by everybody hates you to begin with because when you're an American building, it's like it's like if we had given the National Gallery in Washington. Well, I guess we did in a sense. Obviously born in China, but after all, he was a U.S. citizen. Here we were a group of Americans, coming to England to design their National Gallery. It's kind of an ultimate no-win situation for day one. The way this building, the process they used to kind of do this thing was they picked 5 firms. The family put together, and the National Gallery put together a kind of selection jury that one of the key advisors for that is Louis Kahn. They went all over the world and kind of looked at, Sterling and this one and that one, everybody who was doing kind of major museums, of which a lot have been going on the last 10, 15 years, and decided on 4 firms. At the last minute, Denise kind of got wind of this and kind of formed her way in to talk to them and got them to go look at a big show that we had just designed for the Woollen Museum at that point on American furniture design. And kind of got them intrigued enough that we kind of slipped in at the last minute as the 5th firm in this thing, purely on the basis of Denise's chutzpah, kind of getting wind that this thing was going and kind of pushing us in literally. We probably never would have been in this competition because we've never done a major museum. A little museum edition at Woollen 20 years before, but and still we're on the one hand considered passe, probably on another hand we're still too radical for these guys to kind of look at seriously. At any rate, they did include us. It was Sterling, us, Cahoon, Rolf Pears, and Harry Cobb were the 5 firms. Each firm was told to go away. They had like 8 weeks to come up with some ideas, not a finished design, but some conceptual ideas about the galleries and some ideas about the urbanism, how this building could sit in this very difficult site site in one corner of Trafalgar Square. You weren't necessarily, you didn't have to come back with a complete set of anything. It was just to come back with ideas. Basically what we did was pretty much what you see here. The building changed relatively little from the day of those early schemes. And of course that proves one of the inherent problems with the competition process, particularly when you're dealing with very complex buildings like the Louis Kahn Museum, that you really are, they kept saying, and a lot of competitions say the same thing, we're not buying a scheme, we're just picking an architect. But in point of fact, by the time the architect has invested the most emotional and financial effort into doing one of these things, you don't likely throw away, you don't see many schemes kind of disappear at the end of that kind of, quote, non-competition type of process. So the client had better like what they see. These were all, there was nothing anonymous about this. They were all presented by the people that, by groups of us over a 2-day period. Each team had like 4 hours to kind of sit and talk with the committee, show them our ideas. And in that sense, it was very civilized. It wasn't, your kind of classic closed room. You were pretty much had a chance to kind of verbally present and discuss your ideas. This actual raw drawing of the, so that gives you kind of a flavor of the atmosphere in which this thing designed. Because, like most buildings, particularly complex public buildings, they aren't just exercises in, form and space and structure and program. They're exercises in politics and people and, all kinds of other things that are kind of driving those darn designs. And that isn't to say that all of that is an excuse, but you certainly have to, I think, understand that context to kind of make sense out of why buildings end up the way they do sometimes. This is the way we rendered it. Obviously, this is a rendering by Miles Ritter, who at that point worked in our office. Probably one of the best kind of Beaux-Arts wash renderers in the United States. To kind of give the building this idea of the square, this very difficult site, and we'll get into kind of the complexities of that in a minute. Next slide. I mean, here's the complexity of it, really, and it's a fascinating exercise in populism and high art. I mean, what those Cityrama and London dungeon buses there are there literally 18 hours a day, from 7:30 in the morning till, in the summer, well, till dark. Those guys are standing there, and this is one of the busiest tourist spots in London. I mean, there's something like 5 million people go through this museum in a year, and this is just kind of classic mob Trafalgar Square. And at the same time, it's this kind of very historical place. I mean, Wilkins' original building of the National Gallery kind of sitting there holding up the north end of the square, not terribly well. As we'll see in a minute, Pall Mall going off to the left, Nelson's Column, all that stuff. So this is the kind of, so it's, as designers, we felt like we had to, on the one hand, design a building that was totally subservient to a great extent to the original building because of its classical symmetry, because of a lot of the programmatic reasons that this thing had to absolutely be a seamless kind of connection to the existing collection. And a word about program, the program was very static in the sense that we were going to house around 200 plus pictures of the Northern and Southern Renaissance collection, a collection which is never going to change. You don't just suddenly get new Raphaels, or nor do you get rid of Raphaels. So in a sense, the pictures are there and will always be there. So it's very unlike your typical museum where, every 3 months there's a new show. Nothing was ever going to change in this. It was going to be designed around just these pictures. And if 3 pictures change in 20 years, it would be a miracle. So these are the kind of constraints you were working within. Next slide. Flip that one over. I'm afraid it's upside down. I'm afraid I got these kind of bad. Yeah, great. Here's one of the original competitions. were our first major outing into doing CAD. And just about every one of these drawings, except for the perspective, was a CAD drawing. Even that was laid out on CAD before the watercolor was done. You couldn't really have done this building without CAD from a technical point of view, and certainly from a presentation point of view. You know, being able to draw one Corinthian column and then replicate it through the wonders of CAD is a whole lot better than drawing 30 of them by hand. So this early drawing kind of shows you a kind of Noli representation of the whole Trafalgar area. Noli representation being where all private buildings are hatched, and all public space, whether it's inside or outside, is done in white and crochet. So you get St. Martin's in the field, you get the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery behind it. You get the new site. The new site, in fact, to the left, was available because it had been a department store up until World War II when a B-2 bomb burned it out. And it remained as a parking lot, basically, always with the idea that at some point it was going to be in addition to the National Gallery. But the government was never willing to fund that, and then all the history of schemes that went in finally, as I said earlier, resulted in this competition. Trafalgar Square is a rather difficult space. It has these kind of very important public buildings on it, the South African Embassy, the Chancellery, the Canadian Chancellery, a lot of commercial buildings, the mall going off to all the government, the mall going off to the left to all the government buildings. But it's basically just an immense traffic circle too. I mean, with a lot of very fast, busy traffic, not very easy to get across, and not very well defined, really. Very, kind of an imposed 19th, 20th century square in the middle of it, early 20th century square, but everything else the kind of classic medieval pattern of London, so that there's no right angles anyplace. In fact, in our site, there's not one right angle. It's just a classic old medieval street pattern of London. Next slide. Here you get a flavor for that with the Nelson, the big high reader, a little bit of Las Vegas and merry old England. This is near the end of construction. You can still see scaffolding. And so this building is kind of a bridge, between the formal square, or more or less formal square, Pall Mall going off to the left, and then all this kind of commercial and tourist activity. Next slide. Again, this is one of the original competition drawings. This is about the scale of the actual drawing, which you're looking at it here. A kind of extended elevation, starting at St. Martin's in the field, going through the square, and then to Pall Mall over on the left, showing the change from, St. Martin's, which is kind of, one of your great monuments. I mean, every other church in the United States is modeled on St. Martin's in the field. It's the kind of first example of taking, kind of a Gothic tower and sticking it on top of a classical temple and calling it a church. And a very dramatic kind of juxtaposition of classicism. And in fact, something the British, were masters at for 300 years plus. This kind of wonderful history of British architecture, British classicism, where they always do it in a rather innovative or, quote, wrong way. Most British classicism is typified, including Lucian, by putting these weird spins on kind of using classical vocabulary, but distorting the paradigm to meet other programmatic or stylistic ends. So it was in that kind of context of those kind of radical transformations of classicism that certainly we were interested in coming up with something in that tradition. And given Bob's, kind of immense background in kind of Italian and English classicism, that he's been kind of spending 30 years kind of studying and learning from, it was kind of a natural opportunity, once in a lifetime opportunity to work with those ideas. The Wilkins building, the National Gallery itself, is actually the weakest building on the square. As you can see here, the scale is not very good. The little side porches and the center portico are so far apart. It's rather placid and it just kind of lies there like a big lump. Not really big enough to hold down the northern edge of the square. And in fact, doesn't work very well in pure elevation, albeit it looks pretty darn good when you see it from the sidewalks obliquely, because perspective increases the scale and the layering of the pilasters in the column. And in fact, that's the way most people see it. You really don't see it this way. You know, in fact, to stand here is almost impossible to get there. So this is a kind of classic architectural view that doesn't mean much in kind of the design reality of the square. Next slide. This is the first big presentation model that was done after we won the competition. There was a year and a half of design development, and then in which they never revealed the solution to the public, and then they went public with this model and a whole lot of very fancy drawings, not a great response. I mean, the British Architectural and Critical Press is about the bitchiest in the world. They really tear you from them. You get a pretty hard, you know, you have to have pretty hard skin. And it's kind of fun. It's more fun than the U.S. architectural press because there's always a kind of big dose of humor and sarcasm in it, which, you know, in fact, we had an exhibit that was just at the Architecture League about the design of this building in New York, Architectural League in New York, where we took excerpts, like movie reviews, you know, in the newspaper, pros and cons of 6 years of comments on this building. And some of them are really fascinating, you know, postmodern slime and accusing, you know, Bob, you know, a lot of them got off on the fact that Bob's father was an Italian fruit merchant. And, yeah, there's all kinds of nice class slurs that they get into. And, you know, the building being funded by supermarket heirs and Italian Greek grocers. It goes on and on. But and so this was the representation of the kind of end of schematic design, halfway through design development of the building. Done as a kind of Beaux-Arts model, all in white, kind of cast model. This thing was about 18 feet square, the model, and was sized, it was built in 3 pieces, and it was basically scaled so that it would fit into the cargo hold of a 747. We kind of worked backwards from those dimensions, and that was the scale of the model. Next slide. Here you see the building from the eastern side of the square, looking across, obviously with a telephoto lens. So you get this sense of compression with the original building. You know, what looked rather weak scale when you saw it in straight elevation. When you see it obliquely like this, obviously it's much more impressive because the columns and everything start to compress. And you see where we're beginning to start, that the building literally on its right edge, closest to the Wilkins building, the original building, is almost an exact replication of the pilasters and detailing. And then as it moves towards Pall Mall in this kind of series of almost alto-esque facets that just kind of go, literally connect the plane of Pall Mall back into Jubilee Walk, which is the pedestrian axis that takes you between the two buildings. You begin to drop the ornament off. It begins, and this is kind of a clash with Luchin's gambit. If you look at most of Luchin's in London banks, he's always doing this where, you know, the front facade is very consistent and highly ornamented and has all the classical detailing. But as it begins to move towards a side street, the detailing begins to disintegrate and drop off piece by piece by piece, and then very often it turns into a brick building as it turns the corner. The entrance itself is an interesting problem because the portico on the right of the original building, you know, was meant originally for carriages to drive up, and maybe a couple hundred people a day to get out and go into the building. But now, literally tens of thousands of people are going into the building every day. You've got to go in at grade for handicap and other reasons. And in effect, this new addition is going to be the main entrance to the whole museum for all intents and purposes. Because most of the kind of modern facilities that urban museums want, you know, like bookstores, auditoriums, giant loading docks, information, computer center, you know, all this kind of folderol that really has become, you know, kind of key element in the merchandising of museums, doesn't exist in the original building and can't be easily placed in it. So all of that stuff has got to end up in this teeny little addition, kind of tacked off to one side. And so you weren't going to kind of go build another So the idea was to kind of literally take a classic modern device of the great shadow entrance, you know, where you just slice through the ornament and get your big shadow symbol of entrance, which is kind of classic modern, you know, way of doing it. It didn't compete symbolically with the classicism of the original building, and functionally would just move all those bodies every day that you have to move. Next slide. Here it is with its big gates plus bicycle locks. This is now back before the building was quite finished. And you see the ornament there, exact replication on the extreme right of the original, then beginning to break with the then slightly embedded. It doesn't have a freestanding column like the original building. It's embedded and becomes kind of a symbol of the entrance itself in the traditional sense of the older building. You can see the niches, you know, that start out in full depth and detail, flattening out as they come around. Next slide. Another example of the honky-tonk environment and scale. And you can see, I think, very realistically that, you know, a politely scaled little classical entrance would not stand up against the London Dungeon very well. I mean, you know, those are big, hunky buses. And so the scale of this entrance really has to compete with the scale of the street. Next slide. Here's another view of it. This is the day before the war started, a year ago, January, in the Middle East. Trafalgar Square is obviously the kind of protest place where all the protest marches go. New Year's Eve is kind of the Times Square of London in that sense. And here's kind of a view of the building in the context of that type of event, where it, you know, it really has to have the scale and gutsiness to kind of, you know, look right in this type of environment. Next slide. Probably one of the best pictures we ever got of the building. It's called putting the camera over your head and being lucky. Here's a view again of the building at sunrise from out in the square, where the reflected, the fountains are off at this time of day, so you get this kind of reflected image of the building. You can see the black curtain wall back in the slot to the right, which is where the kind of classicism breaks off, becomes almost a modern museum elevation, looking straight at the older elevation of the original building from the stair, which you'll see in a minute. Next slide. Again, the stair, that same kind of view during the day. Next slide. A view of the ornamental detailing. The amount of, I wish I had some slides of some of the working drawings of this building. The working drawing set of this thing, and it's only about 130,000 square foot building, was 1,200 sheets. And that's just the architectural. The total set is about 2,000 sheets. These buildings are pound for pound and square foot for square foot, these fancy museums, about the most complicated buildings we build today, except for kind of high-tech molecular biology laboratories. I mean, just the complexity of systems and integration, you know, the mechanical systems, the lighting systems, the security systems in these things, they're just immensely complex. I mean, and therefore they're immensely expensive per square foot. And then on top of that, the kind of attention to kind of every lousy inch of this thing is detailed in some of the most beautiful working drawings I've ever seen. I mean, we had 30 people working on this building for 2 years just doing drawings. And the working drawings are absolutely a work of art, of every little piece of detail and ornament in here. I mean, that's the trouble. Lucky Luxons, you know, he could just draw a profile of all this stuff because he knew the masons could go and build it. Today, when you want to do this stuff, you kind of detail it down to the nines in order to get it, because there's nobody really left who can do this without the architect doing all the detailing of it, which in the 19th or early 20th century you wouldn't have done. So this is kind of showing, again, the relationship between the original detailing of the old building and then this kind of wonderful peel away entablature, kind of breaking and flattening. You can see it in its three-dimensionality over on the extreme light and beginning to flatten out as it comes around to your left. Next slide. I mean, the traditions of that kind of architecture, that kind of using scale, and then the kind of, kind of diminishing of them and kind of breaking away the false front of this church facade versus, the simple brick building behind it. And this is a very standard way of doing a certain type of classical building, and certainly one that Bob loves, the contradiction between the formal front and the informal behind. Next slide. Again, a detail of that ornament between the two buildings. Actually, the stone of the new building came out of the very same Portland quarry, Portland stone, that the original building came out of. Obviously, the patina of time, it looks much lighter because it's 150 years newer and hasn't had, the chance to age yet. Next slide. More, just keep going, more examples of the ornament. Next slide. Here again, the play of the new and the old. Next slide, and the scale of the entrance. Here, a bit of the detailing then as you turn into Jubilee Walk, looking back out towards Pall Mall and the square. That's the facade of the Canadian embassy. Beyond the reflections of the original building and the Nelson's column, and then this kind of museum wall, which is the glass wall, which is the stair taking you up to the gallery. Next slide. The gates were a giant controversy. We insulted all the wrought iron workers in England, and they turned out to be easily insulted. These were all kind of laser cut steel and done very flat. Massive, but done two-dimensionally in traditional forms, not beaten out of wrought iron, as they would have been in the 19th century, and we purposely didn't want them, done in a traditional way. We wanted them a reinterpretation of that tradition. In the process, of course, we insulted all the wrought iron workers in England, and they wrote letters to the Times for 3 years, and picketed us even. Next slide. Details then of some of those smaller scale, kind of Egyptroid almost, columns that appear both in the lobby and then around the entrance. The lettering. Next slide. It's upside down, but don't worry about it. Just keep going. A view from within the gates, under the big shadow joints as you come back out from the main entrance, looking back out towards the St. Martin's and the gallery and the square. Next slide. A view from across the street again. There's the traditional wrought iron next door versus our laser cut steel. Next slide. Just keep going real fast through these. Again, a view from Pall Mall, looking back towards some of the lettering. Same view, basically. Just keep going. A view from further down Pall Mall, where you see the building does turn into a kind of common brick building as it turns the corner back into the very small medieval streets off of Pall Mall. The bookstore has its own private entrance right there on the corner. And it's obviously located in a corner because these bookstores are kind of the economic engines of art museums. They generate, $10 million a year, one of these, like at the Met or the National Gallery. Here or at the Louvre, they're immense kind of cash cows. So bookstores are literally front and center in the programming of these things. Above the bookstores, then the kind of mezzanine level windows for some offices and meeting rooms that you see. And then you see this basically blank wall because for all intents and purposes, for conservation reasons and security, most of these museums are totally windowless. They don't allow any windows in them, except for a few examples that we'll get into in a minute. Next slide. Whoops, just turn it up. It's upside down. Does that one too, for refreshment. So this is the view from the back of the building, where you're back in this very tight warren of streets, except this one street actually ends about a block behind where the photographer is, in Leicester Square, which is kind of the big movie theater, Saturday night, funky square of London. And so they wanted a much bigger reading of that street, so we gave them the big billboard, if you will, in limestone, kind of inflected back up from what is this you know, the mechanical back end of the building. Off to your left, you see Jubilee Walk going on through down to Trafalgar Square. Your kind of advertising and whatnot, and your benefactors' plaques and all that kind of stuff. In typical British fashion, they do not put the benefactor plaques on the front of the building, they put them on the ass end of the building, because to put them on the front would be too blatant. Next slide. And show-offy. And here is the same thing, kind of offset, and you see the way through as the pedestrian goes down through Jubilee Walk to the square beyond. In other words, done at a very small scale and very kind of second glance sort of way compared to the classicism of the front. The kid standing on the right, you can read his t-shirt. It's our office t-shirt for this year, and it says, my boss just won the Pritzker Prize, all I got was this lousy t-shirt. The next slide. That's upside down too, sorry. I didn't do very good putting these together, I apologize. Let's go back again to the arrangement and plan. That's all right, go back to there you are, just stay there. The basic idea of the galleries was to carry on, and there's one, like I said, programmatically, there had to be kind of a seamless connection in section and plan with the one-floor nature of all these galleries and suite in the original building. And it had to be kind of contiguous in a historical kind of flow through the museum. So there was, and then the scale of those rooms they were very concerned about the rooms being scaled to the nature of the collection. The collection, the Northern Renaissance collection, a lot of it is quite small. A lot of it is larger and altarpieces and things like this, art basically that was meant to be seen in churches. And so the scale of the rooms, in most cases, had to be very carefully thought of in terms of the specific pictures that were going to be in those rooms. And then it had to be so that you could get to this both from the new entrance and from the original entrance, which would remain open. And also, you had to do all these other things, bookstores, auditoriums, and service docks for the whole facility. Next slide. So then you get this weirdly distorted plan. It's totally out of whack, right? Because the lobby is much too big for this little addition, because really it's sized to the overall size of the whole museum. That giant hunk of crochet, which is blank because for security reasons, this was bombed a month or so ago by the IRA, the bookstore, which we didn't design. They blew up part of, thus choosing. We were all very happy about that kind of. At least they picked the part we didn't do. Is the immense truck docks. I mean, that whole giant hunk of crochet is nothing but truck docks. So the ground floor is really taken up totally with the lobby, the stairs, the bookstore, and your truck docks. Next slide. Then your gallery floor again, where you get this ever so slightly skewed grid of rooms and suite, which the implied kind of Renaissance axis, forced perspective, at B kind of being the bridge into the original building, kind of forcing you back in. A secondary axis along A, which is implied by the lining up of the larger doorways, but still is a series of rooms and suite, and then the much more informal kind of and not lined up series of secondary rooms off to either side. So that you could go through this in a kind of axial way very dramatically, or you could kind of weave through it in a kind of art historical sequence. Next slide. And in between that floor then is a very tight mezzanine floor, which has a whole lot of kind of like the restaurants and backup and service space. Again, very low because in section you had to match the existing level of the main gallery. So you had to jam in two public floors into a very little space underneath the public gallery. Next slide. Don't worry about it, it's the basement, just keep going. And then buried 3 floors underground. This building is a bit like an iceberg. It goes down about as far as it goes up. Your kind of temporary galleries, your auditoriums, your video rooms, that kind of jazz. is all buried down underneath. Next slide. Whoops. Keep going. Just another. Better flip all those. They seem to all be out. Now we're back. Again, this is the original kind of competition drawings of the that main floor, where you can actually see all that stuff that we couldn't show on the other one. Next slide. This is a view in the lobby, this very low lobby, with these very large columns kind of forcing you towards the big stair and up. Lobby is very disappointing in a lot of ways. Needed color, particularly in this very low ceiling. They were a very resistant client. In fact, would not let us do any of the furnishings, took all the furnishings away from us. Vetoed a lot of the interior detailing in the building. There was a lot of fighting in this job, including our kind of walking on the job a couple times. It was a contentious 5 years. Next slide. Some of the original detailing of that lobby that didn't get done with its color, watercolor. That's some of the original furniture designs that didn't get done. Next one. The detail again. The bookstore elevation within the lobby. And in the lobby, you carry the exterior limestone in to the public space with very large joints. Next slide. Some of the earlier conceptual ideas of the ceiling of that lobby, so that when you look up into this kind of indirect cove lighting situation, you get all this kind of color to kind of relieve the lowness of it. Didn't happen. Next slide. Then as you make the turn, you're looking through the glass wall towards the old building outside, and the big stairs taking you up to the gallery beyond. Next slide. The same view looking down with the square off in the distance. And then the interior wall, also done in stone, with the galleries beyond to your right. The landing is at the mezzanine level. Next slide. Same view where you can look back into the galleries a bit through these kind of inside-outside windows, which they did let us do. Those are the only windows we were allowed. They do give you some view from inside the gallery. We always like to do that in all our museums, that you're not totally isolated. That you can relate back to the real world on some level from within the world of art. And so, and one, just to kind of orient yourself so you know where you are in these mazes, these big museums become. And two, just because of the kind of wonderful juxtaposition of the inside and the art and the real world outside. Next slide. Again, Nelson and the facade of the original building through the stair wall. Next slide. You can see that kind of night very dramatically. We did kind of screw up. I mean, they wouldn't let us have a light enough glass in the stairwell. So during the day, it really reads quite dark because of the tint and much too monolithic. At night, it reads much more the way you'd like it to read, where you really do read the inner wall beyond the glass wall with its inscriptions and its inner windows, and juxtaposed to the front. Next slide. Here's the detail then in the original competition drawings of the of that stair, which is writing and all the stone layout. Next slide. This is the original conceptual sketch of that kind of forest perspective, Renaissance perspective, taking you at the top of the stairs to your left into the galleries, with each arch getting slightly smaller so that the pictures kind of push out into it. At least that was the original concept of it. And the top lighting and whatnot from above. Next slide. A view of that. Next slide. Another view. The curators, we had very little say about the hanging of these rooms. We weren't asked, and we were pretty well kept out of it. It's, you know, a lot of curatorial stuff about this kind of stuff is the most weird pseudoscience these days. You know, pictures are exactly 6.2 feet apart. You know, and they have all these rules of thumb. They're just kind of insane. You know, it's because most museum curators life. And so, you know, some of the things that could have happened in terms of more kind of the architecture and the paintings kind of complementing each other never happened. But it basically works, this vista works the way for this design, except you don't have the pictures pushing in from the left and right as well as much as we would have liked to give you a hint of the different kind of layers of galleries in depth as you look down through this. All this kind of detailing, you know, it's caught a lot of flack in England, you know, the kind of partial, you know, detailing of these kind of impacted columns. The proportion of them is not very classically correct. It's more Bob than it is classicism, and the way they're sheared off, you know, and kind of dealt with in a scenographic sort of way has gotten the classicists all really mad at us. Next slide. Because English class, here's the view from the old building as you come through, and this axis that we're looking down stretches, you know, literally 500 feet behind us, all the way through every gallery to, you know, the other end of the museum that we're looking at from behind where this picture is taken. Next slide. Again, some of the off-axis views of that Renaissance axis, where you begin, it breaks down obviously very quickly as you move to the left and the right, and you get the play of the different layers of ornament within the room and within the axis, and then they drop away very quickly because the rooms are quite severe, with just a top molding and a bottom molding, and the Pietro Siena stone. You know, very simple, very laid back. We'll look at them in the section in a minute. Next slide. Again, a detail of the play of those different levels of ornament. Next slide. Another one. Let's keep going. The way this works in section is rather interesting, and it's based basically on Soane's Dulwich Gallery, which is a beautifully small pop-lit gallery from the early 19th century, or late 18th, which that basically lets light in from above, bounces it around, and then kind of filters it down. Now, the reason for that is one, technical, because you want, for conservation reasons, they won't let you have any direct sunlight going into these rooms. So in effect, the whole roof structure is a double-layered light baffle, where all the visible skylights are merely letting light into giant kind of rooms up there, where it bounces around, and then eventually bounces indirectly through the sacks that you actually see in windows in the galleries themselves. And then that's all part of an immensely complex computer-controlled system, which is made up of very fancy incandescents, natural light controlled by computer-driven louvers, and fluorescent system as well up in that space. And the computer basically monitors every 5 minutes what the indoor and outdoor light is, and kind of moves this whole thing. So that in effect it allows the cloud to go over the sun, and you feel the cloud going over the sun, because that happens quicker than the kind of sensing time. So if a cloud comes over, you actually feel it in the gallery that yes, in fact, you know, that's real light. In point of fact, only about 20% of the light in the room is real natural light. Everything else is fake to create the illusion of natural light. And then in turn, as the light levels in the winter, which are abysmal in England, you know, where it's cloudy and rainy and very dark, a lot of that is kind of becomes natural light, but rather seamlessly. You're never quite aware of the change because it's all being kind of computer monitored and driven. It's quite a subtle lighting thing, probably the most sophisticated lighting system that's ever been put into into a contemporary museum. And it's probably the thing that's gotten the biggest rave, I guess, about the building, since everybody hates the architecture and everybody loves the galleries. Next slide. Again, the plan, next slide, let's just keep going, repeat. Some of the early design drawings of that view. This is the second axis. We're standing in the Renaissance axis, looking down the long cross axis through the built rooms and suites. Originally, there was to be a window at the end of that axis that looked back out to the square again, to kind of, again, kind of cue you in. It was a gigantic fight with the curators. They wanted to put some dinky little altarpiece. The curators cannot let go of an axis. They always want to jam an altarpiece And of course, most of these altarpieces, in fact, that are in the museum, were in little chapels. They weren't in giant naves of big churches. They were in teeny little, provincial churches in little chapels. So it's kind of stupid. And in fact, the one they put, so they would never let us put this window in, although the wall's detailed, and a lot of people say that someday they'll restore the window. It desperately wants it. There's this teeny little altarpiece you'll see in a minute at the end of this axis. Above, then, you can see the kind of the light monitor with the kind of beveled walls, kind of the transitional walls between the hanging wall and the light monitor above. Next slide. Here's what actually is this teeny little altarpiece at the end of the axis. Next slide. I didn't see the difference between that and the first one. There it is. Oh no, that's looking the other way, where there's actually a bigger altarpiece. It works pretty well looking in the reverse direction, because there actually is an altarpiece big enough at that end to actually hold the axis. Next slide. Here again, you can see those big light monitors, the outside skylight, the big diffusing chamber, which is also the mechanical plenum. In fact, one of the most interesting spaces in the building, which nobody ever gets to see, is this kind of wonderful kind of loft, industrial loft, that was this giant light box, and in fact, sitting on top of this thing. And you kind of walk through that and you kind of peer down and through the galleries below. It also means that it makes it very easy to work all the lighting equipment, because you don't have to get up on ladders in the galleries. You literally can handle every one of the individual incandescent lights can be kind of focused and held and worked on from up within that gallery. Here then you can see the basement stuff down below grade, your entry level, your very low mezzanine, restaurant level, and then your gallery level. Next slide. Again, this is the teeny little altarpiece at the end of the great axis, the light coming from above. In this, you can get a sense of the different color temperatures of light. It's a very difficult building to photograph, because in fact there's 3 different color temperatures of light, which your eye doesn't register, but the film does. So you can see, like right now, the top of this is very daylit, but the actual wall is obviously incandescent because it started to go yellow in the photograph, which is the color temperature of the incandescent light. Obviously, to your eye, it doesn't read that way the way this photograph does when you're there. But the kind of very careful detailing of rooms like this, the preservationists surrounds the way the molding just tips into the vista, all those kind of things. I mean, just thousands and thousands of hours goes into working out that kind of subtle perspective and classical detail. Next slide. Here's one of the cross-axis windows. This is one of the windows within the stairwell, which has a bench within it, and then has this diffuser on it a lot of the day, so you don't get any direct light through it. But then you see the ornament of the original facade beyond of the building, of the Wilkins building. Next slide. Another view of those windows along the stairwell. Next slide. One of the side vistas, one of those kind of oblique vistas where the doors are not lined up and not arched like the main doors of the central gallery. Next slide. Back to the central axis, but you're looking at it off axis, so you get these weird scale juxtapositions of the different scale size columns. Next slide. And of course, this is the way you really see the building, and that's the problem with most architectural photography. It's taken without people in it, and the detailing of a building like this is really dependent and designed around the idea of the hordes of people that are going to be juxtaposed against it, and it has to have enough guts, enough scale, enough toughness to look good in this context rather than the one we've been looking at it in. Next slide, where they always look good. Next slide. Again, some of those details which we love so much, but a lot of people hate, the detail of the incised letter, the granite of the step itself, the limestone, and the pietrocene base of one of the perspective columns, and then how that's sheared off and impacted into the next column. I mean, it takes somebody, just to give you an idea, probably, one person probably spent a year just, I know he did, one guy spent a year just detailing that perspective axis. The way every stone came together and then how that worked mathematically to size every stone to diminish within the perspective with one person's work for a whole year. Next slide. The top of one of those columns. Next slide. This is the way you do that kind of detailing. It's all done full size. These are full-size computer plots. That's the great virtue of the CAD, is it allows you to do, every detail can be plotted out full size and hung up on the wall. And literally, there were hundreds of full-size foam core details all over the office for a couple of years, plus two-dimensional drawings of full-size details, just draping every surface. Because you really have to do this stuff at full size. You can't do it, kind of 8 inches to a foot. Next slide. That's just the detailing of the door. This is the design of a bench which never got built, done full size in foam core. Next slide. Some early sketches for a bench design, one of the banquettes and bench designs. Again, with both section of relief of all of this and elevation all done in the same kind of sketch. Next slide. This is the one piece of furniture we got in the whole building, which was kind of information desk. It's the only piece that we actually designed. Next slide. And then back again. Next slide. Back out to the square. Next slide. I think that's the last one. It's just this is like what you're looking at. 6 years effort, from the kind of competition phase to when this thing opened. This immense amount of blood, sweat, and tears. And in some ways a compromised building. There's a lot of things. The basic idea of the building held up and got built. There were a lot of fights and everything, but it got built. And I think, we're awfully proud of it. But in a lot of ways, given the nature of the site, the kind of political constraints, this is in some ways a very laid-back sort of building. It offends the modernist because it's got classical detailing, and it offends the classicist because it's the classical detailing is kind of distorted in a very modern way, in a very quote non-traditional way. And British classicism now has become totally doctrinaire. So many of them are into this, including the Prince, into this kind of biblical, holier-than-thou classicism where, there's only one way to do it, and it somehow, was passed down with the Holy Grail, and it's extremely dry and very dead and profoundly reactionary, to put it bluntly, both politically. And the trouble with these guys who are doing it, mostly English, it's a political movement. These guys are just one step up from fascists who are doing most of these classical buildings, including the Brits. And obviously, that is our attitude towards classicism, and it certainly is in our politics. And so, this building represents, a much more, in our feeling, truly British tradition of classicism, which is a much more eclectic, open-ended, and free use of classicism, reinterpreting it constantly to a different era and a different set of conditions, including peace marches. Next slide. Now, I'll quickly run through some stuff on the Seattle building. The Seattle building is interesting because in some ways it didn't have all the political problems of the National Gallery. We had much more freedom and much more client support to do the building, and we had much more control over the building, both inside and out, in the end. And in some ways, therefore, it's a more successful building, I think, because it didn't have to kind of get filtered through committees. You didn't have to put, for instance, in England, one of those Corinthian columns that we just looked at would go before a committee where they'd vote on the correctness of your Corinthian detailing. That's what really offended Bob. He basically said, look, you as the client have every right to ask me to redesign this 100 times until I get it right, programmatically, functionally, et cetera, to meet your needs. But when it comes to the detailing of a Corinthian column, you know, I know more than you'll ever forget about that. What in the hell did you hire me for if you think you know how to do it better than me? If you think you do, you sign the drawings. And so, you know, it was just battle after battle. Whereas in Seattle, the client was smart enough to say, look, you know, you're my architect, you know how to do these things, you do it. Now, the inspiration for the Seattle building in a lot of ways comes from the tradition. This is a series of details of the Philadelphia Art Museum that obviously Bob grew up with as a kid in Philadelphia. And then, you know, it's this kind of wonderful kind of classicism and the you know, where you get the wonderful polychrome. They only had enough money to do one entablature in Philadelphia, so you only can see this when you look one direction to the eastern pediment, basically. But you know, that kind of tradition of the kind of beautiful use of color within the pediment and within the ornament, all terracotta, most of it here, was one that, you know, we really wanted to do something with in Seattle. I mean, the actual representation that you'll see in a moment is quite different, and certainly not as straight as it is in this Philadelphia example. Next slide. I mean, here's the representation of the whole ground floor ornament, where it becomes much more abstract, much more two-dimensional, and much more, but still within that tradition, the idea, and in a sense, kind of inverted the tradition. It's not at the top of the building anymore, it's at the base of the building, because this is a really windowless museum. The National Gallery had a few windows in the galleries, but because of the nature of the collection in this museum, they wanted absolutely no natural light, the curators. It all had to be artificial. And so the only windows in this building are in the lobby and then in some of the offices on the very top of the building. As none of the kind of wonderful natural lighting through the roof that we were able to do in the National Gallery. Next slide. It's, again, a classic downtown museum, but in the American grid sense. Not on Trafalgar Square. It's just another block in downtown Seattle. Pike Street Market is kind of off to the left and upper part near the water there. Big new high-rise office buildings all around it. A kind of funky First and Second Avenue are basically funky commercial street. First Avenue still has, you know, strip joints, and in fact, when this opened, the strip joint across the street of it probably put up a sign saying, "A lively lady welcomes art to First Street." So you know, this is a real classic American downtown, and you know, the museum is basically relocating from a building out in a park on the edge of town, on the lake, right downtown for all the obvious reasons. And this is all part of that same kind of thing of marketing art, which is a real big deal these days. You know, this is big business. The bookstores, the number of people that they want to draw by being downtown. The setback, every other building here is built right out to the street. Seattle is kind of the ultimate kind of urban design bullshit city in the United States. And the urban designers decided that they were going to have these giant vistas on all the streets that run uphill. In other words, these University Street, Union Street, Pine Street are all very steep. You're running from the water up quite steep against the hillside. And all of those were to be widened in order to give vistas to the water. Crazy idea, because you know what, it's going to take 100 years before all the buildings on those streets are torn down and rebuilt with these setbacks. So the poor little art museum is the only one that has a setback in all this thing, giving up all. And, you know, it's kind of a crazy urban design idea about the city grid, American city grid, because obviously without that setback, you see down to the water because of the elevation perfectly all right. I mean, it's this kind of absurd stuff that urban designers get into when they try to trick up the gridiron city. But anyhow, so it has this setback. It has a kind of curved, inflected facade because it's a very small building surrounded by bigger buildings, so you're trying to at least tie the two facades together to give a thing bigger scale in the city. Next slide. And here it is then. You're kind of looking up the hill at the curved facade. You can see see it. It's basically a windowless box, except for your lower lobby with all its ornament. These kind of end windows that you see here are basically at the end of the circulation corridors. The windows at the top are the kind of offices and back of the house space. You can see the big office buildings and whatnot around it. Basically a party wall to your left. Next slide. Whoops, another slide. Keep going. A detail then of that entrance. The kind of holding the street facade on First Avenue, right out to the sidewalk, the beginning to bend back to University. The use of the kind of granite and terracotta ornament to create this frieze to kind of make the thing, when it hits the street, kind of interesting to the public in a good commercial sense, but still give it some civic symbolism, richness, and decoration. The big limestone facade, windowless, then fluted to give it some scale and decorative detail as it goes up in a series of kind of half-round flutes. Next slide. Another detail of that, the big scale opening of the main entrance to give you the big shadow to read as entrance again. The ornament kind of slipping right across the front of it. The play of scale then between the ornament and the architectural opening. Next slide. What's missing is the hammering man, a big Borofsky statue, 50 feet high. It's supposed to stand in front of the building. Next slide, it kind of had an ill-fated inauguration in November. Next slide. They started to put it up on Sunday, and whoops, down the hammering man came. They dropped 11 tons of steel on top of the crane. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but it did kind of bruise his hammering arm. And so he got shipped all the way back to Connecticut to get rebuilt. Basically, the arm moves very slowly. It's a big hydraulic ram, so the hammer and the arm are going up and down all the time. And the building really needs this because the kind of scale of this great monumental figure against this very blank box, it desperately kind of needs this. Hopefully it'll be back up by June. Next slide. A detail then of kind of looking down the street with just a fragment of the big letters incised up high, because you do see this building from the expressway to some extent. The big scale kind of incised letters and the kind of proper letters over the entrance below. Next slide. The kind of play of all those kind of KPF office buildings and whatnot against the entry facade on First Street. The kind of weird kind of grade conditions. You literally have to kind of, grade is dipping so crazy around this corner that you have to kind of dive down into the entrance through a little kind of expedient stair, or you go down and around the actual corner itself. Next slide. Kind of then all the walls detailed, because these are major bus stops on all these kind of, so all the walls are detailed so that people can kind of sit on them in a very informal way. Also turns out to be the cool place to skateboard in Seattle, and mountain bike down the stairs at 30 miles an hour. Pretty dramatic. They hardly even touch from the top to the bottom. Next slide. Again, the detail from outside on the sidewalk looking into the grand stair inside that connects the 2nd Street lobby with the 1st Street lobby. Next slide. Another entry detail. Next slide. This is, again, kind of the working out of the detailing of a lot of that in the office. Kind of the full-size mock-ups of the actual incising of the limestone done in foam board. And then some of the big-scale models done on the right. Next slide. Kind of looking up into those flutes you just saw in foam core, the terracotta, the granite. Next slide. Moving around then to the side. Next slide. Then up the stairway, this is the setback stair, the outside part of the inside stair. Again, using those kind of Egyptoid columns to kind of frame the secondary entrance of the restaurant. Next slide. The play of that ornament as it changes scale from the larger restaurant to the left to the typical opening to the right. Next slide. This is the 2nd Street elevation, which is much more recessive, not inflected, just lined right up with all the other buildings along 2nd Street. It becomes totally two-dimensional, except for a little setback where the actual door is itself, and has all the service entrances as well. Next slide. That entrance, looking head-on early in the morning, faces east, as the bigger scale ornament of the entrance kind of cascades down to the service door to your right. Next slide. Here then, the kind of building in plan, and this series of kind of lower floor public spaces. Again, because you have literally a story and a half between the two entrances, the stair connects those. Halfway up that stair is the restaurant. At the lower 1st Street elevation level that you can see here, you have your auditoriums and then backup space behind them, classrooms and whatnot. Up in the upper right, in the isometric actually is a better sense of how all those spaces stack together between the lower 1st Street and the upper 2nd Street. At the 2nd Street level then you have your temporary galleries, which you see on the plan number 5 over there. And then you enter a more conventional stair and elevator system to take you up to the 3 levels of gallery floors above that. Next slide. This is the 1st Street lobby, bookstore through that wall, information, codes, and the beginning of the big Chinese figures that sit within the stair itself. That's one of the early sketches of the exterior elevation that they turned into a vase that they turned into a mural. Next slide. This is the view down towards the classroom. You're standing in the 1st Street entrance. The restaurant is above this lower corridor, and then the big stair taking you up to the 2nd Street entrance to your right. Next slide. The view up that stair. Using some of the same ideas that we used at the National Gallery of using the arches to kind of imply the space. They're not structural, obviously. But here, done much more successfully because they allowed us to use color and kind of make this a much more cheerful and kind of fun space. Kids really love this. They climb all over this stuff and climb up and down the stairs. It's become a very popular space in the city, and also it's very beautiful at night because it all reads from the outside, obviously. Next slide. Then the upper floors plan of the upper levels. You can see the typical plan, like 6 or 7. To the curved wall are your small kind of smaller galleries, which are basically more traditional and older art. The collection is rather polyglot, a lot of Eastern stuff, very strong Eastern collection, not terribly good contemporary. But the bigger galleries to the inside are basically your contemporary galleries, and then the ones to the outside are your older, more period room type of collections, decorative arts, etc. And then they're very carefully, the center axis down through the middle with windows at either end kind of hold those together. And then you get these cross axes that allow you to get this kind of tear and compare thing across a couple hundred years of art from one side to the other. Then you have your basement, your kind of functioning office floors and all that sort of thing stacked above and below the galleries. Next slide. So it's just a big loft building for all intents and purposes. This is that kind of central curved axis with a view back to the city at both ends, looking off to the right to the big contemporary galleries, to the left, the much more traditional period rooms. Next slide. This is the end of one of those axes, looking out towards the water, place to sit, and that to your right is a small resource education room that happens on every floor with the view. Next slide. This is the period side, the smaller galleries, your decorative art collections. Next slide. We have much more control over the detailing of this stuff and the hanging and layout. We work with the curators much closer than we did at the National Gallery. Here, looking at one of the European galleries out towards one of the modern galleries. Next slide. Again, in one of the modern galleries, the large-scale ones. Next. Just keep going.
Oh, that's it.
Okay, that's it. All right, great. So, I guess just to sum up, these two buildings, there's a lot of things similar about problem. There's a lot of things different. One's very American, one's an American's interpretation of a whole set of English traditions. One's a client that, you know, kind of a very close client-architect relationship. The other one's a rather dicey, political, and contentious client-architect situation. I mean, both buildings are successful in their own way. There's certainly were, you know, kind of once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for all of us, for Bob for sure, and for all of us that got to work on them, because they literally are the kind of buildings that most architects only get to do once in a career if they're lucky. The kind of level of detailing, the level of just everything that you do in these things is pretty extraordinary and pretty much outside of normal practice. So, you know, it was a great experience. I think we'd all be fairly happy if we never have to do another art museum, in some ways, at least those of us that work on it. 5 years or 6 years of your life on 2 big museums is probably about enough for anybody. And probably, in reality, we probably never will do another one, because I have a feeling, you know, these are real showboat kind of buildings symbolically. The kind of clients that commission them tend to want to have their architect, and if you do 2 of them, that's probably all you'll ever get to do. I guess Richard Meyer's done a few more than that in Sterling, but my guess is those are probably the 2 that our office will ever do, except for maybe some minor, very minor stuff, museums, but certainly in terms of major museums, I would guess that's it. And of course, the kind of things that we all learn, you know, about the detailing of buildings like this. And in the end, I think that's really important, and none of the critics talk about, you know, is that, you know, you can theories come and go, attitudes towards architecture come and go, but the kind of attention to detail, the quality that goes into these buildings, I think, you'll have to answer that for yourself, you know, will last far beyond the petty little arguments, you know, of Pomo and decon and this and that and the other. Because these buildings, you know, most of what goes into them is really just the skill of a group of people working together for many years. You know, one designer, Bob, you know, spending a lifetime learning how to do this stuff and then getting a chance to do it once. And that's what will hold up over time, you know, I would think. In other words, you know, not whether it's modern or classical, not whether it's two-dimensional or whatever, you know, you like or don't like about it on that level. In point of fact, it's just like, you know, a beautifully detailed Nice building or a beautiful detailed Luxembourg building. You should be able to, you know, kind of enjoy and understand those and learn from those, whatever the style is, because styles come and go. But kind of the quality of architecture, the quality of kind of detailing and putting architecture together, that's a constant over time, I hope, and I hope we gave it our best. Thank you.